This is the Flyerdelphia Podcast, presented by SportsTalkPhilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaning. Hello, Flyers fans, and welcome into another episode of the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com. I'm your host, Kevin Durso, joined once again by Rob Riches and Dan Heaning. We start this week's show with a recap of the NHL Draft. So last week, we previewed the draft and the second overall pick the Flyers had, and on Friday night, the Flyers selected Nolan Patrick with the second overall pick. On the show last week, we seemingly predicted this, right, guys?
That's right. That's something we pretty much hit the nail right on the head. It obviously looked like within the past few weeks, Nico Hischier was going to go first, and obviously if he fell into the Flyers' hands at number 2, that would have been pretty cool, but now the Flyers, with their shiny new center, Nolan Patrick, obviously I think that this is a great fit. I'm very much excited about this pick. I've been watching Nolan Patrick highlights basically since draft night.
Well, and that's what we said. We kind of talked about Nico Hischier as being the best player available in the draft, so kind of wasn't a surprise that he went first overall.
Absolutely not, and he's going to be a great fit in New Jersey. No question about it. He's going to be able to go there and play right away, but Nolan Patrick has the same chance here in Philadelphia. But the one thing I really want to get across with the Nolan Patrick pick is, especially in Philadelphia, there's this need for immediacy, that it has to happen right away. And everybody's got to temper their expectations a little bit. This guy's not going to be Patrick Laine. He's not going to be Austin Matthews right out of the gap. You got to give him time to grow and develop, because every kid develops differently. Like, look at Steve Stamkos. He didn't have the greatest rookie season ever, but the very next year he scored like 50 goals. So just give this kid time, let him develop the way Nolan Patrick's going to develop, and just move on.
And I agree with you, Dan, because I think that one of the things about possibly getting Hischier, if that was who was available at number 2, was there was seemingly a temptation to be able to send him back to juniors with the lack of experience in the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League. Nolan Patrick's been in Brandon for 3 seasons. He's as seasoned as he's going to get there. That's what Bob McKenzie was saying on the broadcast. There's nothing else he has to prove.
Nothing else to prove down there.
Exactly. There's nothing else to prove.
He said the same thing about Ivan Provorov last season. So, he could very easily go 2 for 2. Bob McKenzie, he knows his stuff. So, absolutely.
Of course. And I'm right there with you with that, because, and we talked about this too, with the chemistry that he could have with Provorov being a teammate. That was Nolan Patrick's best season in the WHL, was when he was playing with Ivan Provorov that season before Provorov made the jump to the NHL. So if Patrick's ready to go, which I seem to think that all signs would point to that at some point, you're going to open up a spot for him, it seems like. I feel like that actually has already been done. We'll get to that in a second. With Nolan Patrick, this is a guy who I think made it foolproof. It made it foolproof in a way. You have the need to put him in immediately because of the fact that he really can't do much more in junior level. And he does fit an immediate need. And I think the temptation to hold him back and shelter him is gone because the team is kind of trying to turn a corner. So instead of having the temptation with Hischier like you may have and still kind of relied on the let them develop in the junior level, there's really nothing to do like that with Nolan Patrick.
Anybody else get a future captain vibe from the kid?
I've always had that vibe.
Once Claude Giroux's done, he hangs him up. He's taught the kid everything he knows, that Nolan Patrick will be the next guy to get the say. I think that absolutely about this kid. I think the same thing about Nico Hischier in New Jersey. I think Nolan Patrick will be a captain at one point with the Philadelphia Flyers.
Well, and he was an 18-year-old captain with Brandon, too, so he's got the leadership ability. There's no question about it. And that's one of the things I liked about Nolan Patrick is the fact that he was able to lead a team. And they weren't going to be the best team because they had lost a lot of talent from one year to the next. And he's got a determination that in a season where he was going to face adversity with the injuries. He was coming off the double hernia surgery and trying to come back from that. So he faces the adversity. He goes through it as a professional, handles it very professionally. He carries himself well by all accounts from what we can see. And what's not to like about the way the kid carries himself and being a professional as an 18-year-old? That's what we like about Ivan Provorov. The fact that he looks like he's been there, done that, and he's 20 years old with 1 season under his belt.
Hopefully, because in the last show, we compared him to Eric Lindros and Mike Richards. Hopefully, he has a better relationship with the local media, because Lindros and Richards didn't exactly get along with the Philadelphia sports media when they were here.
Yeah, so far I don't get that vibe, but you never know as you get there.
Has there been a media member that Pronger ever got along with, though?
Well, Pronger never got along with the media really either, but he spoke a little bit better than.
Yeah.
Lindros was a little tough at times, and
all I can remember is the classic. What does it matter to you? Puck went in the net.
That was a
unique.
You
love Chris Pronger.
Yeah, of course. That was a unique circumstance, though. I mean, it's tough to ask a player that question when you're in the heat of defeat, kind of, and you feel like it was taken away from you.
Oh yeah.
So I can see that. We really previewed a lot of what Nolan Patrick had to bring to the Flyers last week, but it's worth repeating in some cases, just some of the things that he's able to bring. We talked about his size being something that was so desperately needed, and it was a theme for the draft, and we'll get into the other picks later on, but the size was a clear theme. He couples size with strength and skill and speed very well. He's a well-rounded player for an 18-year-old kid, and that's probably why people think he's going to jump right into the NHL too. He's well-rounded. He doesn't have any glaring flaws to his game he needs to work on. He'll come out and tell you he needs to be a better skater, and he needs to still have a lot of other areas where he can learn and grow because the NHL is going to be different, and rightfully so. That's what Provorov was saying too. But there's so many comparisons. I really do feel like this is a kid, even though he's a center and doesn't play the same role that Provorov does, they have a lot of similarities because of the way they carry themselves and coming from the same organization. It's really no surprise to see why Ron Hextall likes these prospects from Brandon, even and putting aside the connection that he has to the Brandon Wheat Kings as a former player there himself. It's no surprise. They're a well-run organization that has players who are ready to go almost from the start.
And believe me, Nolan Patrick's going to have his hiccups. Ivan Provorov had his hiccups early on, and he just bounced back. So that's what's going to be the telltale sign of Nolan Patrick's time in Philadelphia, how he bounces back from those tough times, whether they happen in October or December or March.
I don't think anybody is looking for a Rookie of the Year here, a Calder Trophy winner. No, I don't think anybody was looking for it with Provorov. What I think people are looking for out of Nolan Patrick is the same thing they got out of Provorov, which was, everybody, you remember, and it's hard not to forget the third game of his NHL career in Chicago and how horrible it was for him. And as a rookie, you felt bad for him. It's his third game, but it's understandable. And you look at it and you go, how does the kid bounce back from this? And look what he was able to do by the time February and March rolled around, and he's leading the team in ice time, and he's playing like a number one defenseman, and he's 19 years old. It's just amazing, and that's the thing. If Nolan Patrick can come in, maybe have his hiccups in October, and then we get to January, and you're watching a guy who's way more well-rounded, way more accustomed to the NHL game, it's going to be a great thing.
I think, honestly, the thing about Patrick we're also going to worry about is obviously his injury history. That is cause for concern, and that's something he could very well run into at the pro level. Obviously, it's something everybody's got to deal with, so it's not like it's something that he's particularly, in his own right got to worry about. The rate of injury, the way that it is in the NHL, I mean, he can get hurt, but that's something that, he'll be able to bounce back from, and, we could see how we could adjust to that at the pro level as well.
Yeah, you don't get healthier coming from being a teenager into a 20-year-old into a 30-year-old. It only just goes downhill. So hopefully that kid doesn't run into too many injury issues, because he ran into a ton of injury issues in the junior leagues. That prospect doesn't look great. You just hope that nothing really bad happens.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference between injury history or a potential injury when you look at what happened to Connor McDavid in his rookie season, and then something like if Nolan Patrick has a nagging injury. There's a difference between a freak injury and a nagging injury. So I don't think anybody's going to question his health if something freakish happens and you get hit with the puck in the wrong spot and something happens, okay. I think people don't want to see the constant, he's got a lower body injury and he's day-to-day. He's got an upper body injury now, and he's day-to-day. That's probably cause for concern. I truly don't think that was the determining factor in Hischier going 1, Patrick going 2. I think people just thought Hischier was the better all-around player, and that's where the pick came from. I truly believe that. So that's why I look at Nolan Patrick and I go, I don't think the injury history is something to truly worry about. And then there was that report that came out that said the Flyers were massively concerned. They had extreme concerns about his injury history. I think that was overblown, and the Flyers kind of admitted that because they did their due diligence. We knew that coming in. There's nothing wrong with that at this point. I think you go forward with it, assuming he's fully healthy. His goal is to be completely healthy when training camp rolls around and show what he's got. And the first step of that is when development camp rolls around.
And that's more or less a matter of, who's going to know that about his injury history better. The team that's been scouting this kid, for weeks now, or the dude who's just kind of hanging out at his house blogging all day,
For real.
Well, the one thing, too, about injury history, because when Lindros was with the Flyers, it was kind of always something. It wasn't always the same injury. Like, it became concussions later on, but it would, every once in a while he'd take a puck to the eye, so he'd be out for, a duration of a season or, a good chunk of games because of that. It'd always be something. And with Nolan Patrick, especially in the junior leagues, it was always something. It wasn't just a sports hernia. There was a shoulder injury. There was a potential knee injury. It was always something. So you just hope that type of luck doesn't follow him to the NHL.
So while the Nolan Patrick pick was somewhat predictable, I don't think anybody could have predicted what came later on Friday night. And the Flyers got another first-round selection, and that wasn't too much of a surprise because it was no secret that the Flyers had a lot of picks to work with and that they may try to utilize some of those picks to move up. But they made a trade to get back into the first round, and they traded Brayden Schenn to the St. Louis Blues and acquire the 27th overall pick. They get a player out of the deal in Jori Lehtera and a conditional first-round pick in 2018 that becomes theirs if it's top 10 protected. So if the Blues somehow get a top 10 pick, the pick goes to the 2019 draft and becomes a first-round pick there. And the Blues have options to continue to push it off until 2020, of which, if they did, it would be a first-round pick and a third, I believe, was the deal. I mean, the conditions are not really here or there as much. As much as it was getting back into the first round, getting some player in exchange for Brayden Schenn. Sure, the comparisons, and we'll get into the other aspects of the Schenn trade in a little while, but you look at the comparison between Brayden Schenn and Jori Lehtera, and it really isn't comparable, other than the fact that they had fairly similar cap hits. The production is not the same, and things like that, so that's not really here or there with player for player. The picks were obviously the more important part of that deal. With that pick, the Flyers drafted another forward. It was another center, actually, Morgan Frost, from the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds. And so what did you guys think of this pick, and what did you guys think of going after somebody else like that in the first round?
I thought it was an interesting pick, to say the least. Morgan Frost, obviously not the flashiest prospect, and if you look at how he was ranked, Central Scouting, they counted him 31st rather among North American skaters. Bob McKenzie said he was 38th, and McKean said he was 41. But on the opposite end of that spectrum, you have future considerations calling him number 55. You have 72 by ISS Hockey, so it's something where he's pretty much all over the place. He's a pretty tough guy to rank. And
yeah, recruits had him in like their top 30 or something like that, and it made the pick seem perfectly justified. But you mentioned ISS. Hockey Prospect had him in that mid-round range, kind of, and it was like, so it felt like a reach at first, but he was a player with growing value as the draft got closer.
I guess it's because when you look at his year-to-year stats with his time with the Sioux Greyhounds in the OHL, he starts out, scoring 7 goals, 27 points, and last season, that blows up in his second year to 20 goals and 62 points. So that's something where he's obviously just going to keep growing, and he'll go back there for another season next year, and they'll see how he can do with another season in the OHL under his belt.
Yeah, and there were people who loved this pick. I mean, absolutely from the get-go loved it, and I don't blame some people for it. It was a little bit of a shocker. I think the bigger shock was that Schenn was in the trade to get the pick.
Yeah.
Just given the fact that he had such a big role in the power play and in the scoring last year, even if a lot of it was power play production, it was still a big part of their success on the power play for a certain point of time last season and moving forward, because you obviously had other players that were supposed to make the second power play unit better. You have Chris Knoblauch come in, who's going to run the power play as an assistant coach. So you're looking at all these factors and you're going, what are the possibilities? And then it's like now all of a sudden a big piece of the first power play unit is gone and they're going to have to replace it. And, maybe that comes into play with these kids, with Nolan Patrick being one of the key factors to that, because Patrick's probably got a slot now because Brayden Schenn was traded in some way, shape, or form. I mean, it's not saying that Patrick's going to suddenly play the wing spot that Schenn was playing. He probably slots into a center spot, and somebody else who was a center moves over to a wing spot. The point is that there's a roster spot available for Patrick to slide into now that Schenn's gone and out of the picture. So that's where it made some sense to me. But I looked at the pick at first, and you just felt like it was kind of off the radar, and you were wondering what's the value of this pick to get back into the first round like that. And then you kind of read up on him a little bit, and you realize this is a good. He has two-way ability, he's got scoring ability, he's got room for growth, and he was growing at a rapid pace in his last season before the draft. So that's all positive going into next season.
Also considered a very smart playmaker and excellent skating ability, which there were some tweets saying that he wasn't a dynamic skater, but everything else I've read about it indicates that he is an excellent skater, and that works well with the next pick that the Flyers took. It might seem like a little bit of a reach, but Ron Hextall's reached before. He reached for Travis Sanheim, and all indications is that will be a good pick for Ron Hextall, so perhaps this will be one as well.
Yeah, and Sanheim's a great comparison, at least in terms of the off-the-radar aspect of it. I remember that draft year where Sanheim was selected in 2014 as being, and I think we talked about this when we were reviewing Hextall's drafts last week, it was a very forward-heavy first round, and there were guys like Kasperi Kapanen, I think, was still on the board at that time, and things like that, and everybody wanted them to go forward, and they opted for the defenseman. What's that?
So that was the guy I wanted him to take.
Yeah, we were really looking forward to the possibility of Sammy Kapanen's boy playing in the orange and black.
And then you think about it, Kev. You think about it, all right? They take Kasperi Kapanen. Pittsburgh doesn't, and they don't trade him to Toronto for Phil Kessel.
And look what that got them.
So
yeah, no, you make a valid point.
Could have had a lot of ramifications throughout the league. The Flyers took Kasperi Kapanen, but obviously Sanheim's continuing to grow and develop, and he's still looking like a savvy pick.
I saw Sanheim during a Phantoms game last year, and he was as smooth a skater as I've seen, and looked tremendous in terms of trying to be a mobile defenseman. So there are big things to come from him. I still don't know if he's going to make the team at a camp this year, just because of the fact that there's so many defensive prospects to turn to and not enough slots. And I don't think you want to have a blue line that has 3 rookies on it by any stretch, because it feels like that would be the way it would have to go for Sanheim to make the roster.
Yeah, he's certainly no Big Sam, but I'm still looking forward to him. I'm still excited about him.
Oh, there's tons of reason to be excited about him. He's got such great potential at this point, and one more year is not going to hurt him in the AHL, especially if it could only be a partial when you really think about it. He could be called up at any time. The first round was certainly interesting. It started off it was pretty early. Everybody knew where the Flyers pick was going with the second overall selection and Nolan Patrick. And then the surprise came with the Morgan Frost pick by getting back into the first round by trading Brayden Schenn. So on day 2, Ron Hextall wastes no time again and trades again to move up in the draft. He goes from 44 to 35, trades a couple additional picks to get there as well. He traded a third rounder and a fourth rounder, so he traded 75 and 108 to get to 35. And they drafted Isaac Ratcliffe. And guys, I love this pick. I absolutely love this pick.
Yeah, I'm thrilled with that Ratcliffe pick.
Yeah, you predicted it, Kevin.
You're right. I had said that they were going to move up and possibly package the 44th and maybe I said 107th, not 108th, and I didn't include a third rounder. But yeah, it was exactly the type of move I thought they would make. Ratcliffe wasn't the guy I thought they were going after. I'm not going to complain about it at all because of the fact that Ratcliffe was projected to be a first-round pick himself. So to get a guy like that in the second round, and he's got all the tools, he's tall as anything. He's 6'6". So this is like Sam Morin in forward mode, and Sam Morin's a monster to look at, kind of if you're trying to stand next to him for measurable's sake. But I look at this pick and I go, this is, Dan, you talked about this so much last week about getting the size factor back. This is the type of player.
This is definitely the type of player. He's a young kid already. He's 6'6", 203 pounds. He's got good hands, but once he bulks up and he gets like that man strength, that man weight that you need to be in the NHL, he's going to be impossible to remove from the front of the net. And that is going to be so crucial because you're going to have an aging Wayne Simmons by the time this kid hits the lineup, if Wayne Simmons is even with the Flyers at all. And who knows what kind of power forwards they'll have at that point, if they'll have any power forwards. But there is a caveat to being that big. He needs to work on his skating. And it kind of complements with the previous pick with Morgan Frost because you have a guy who's small but fast and can make dynamic plays. Well, then here's the guy that can finish him.
Yeah, and I love the fact that he's a left winger too, because It's something where the Flyers have made a lot of these selections in previous drafts, and when they addressed forward quite a bit last year, in 2016, it was a lot of centermen, it was a lot of players like that, and there was still a fair mix of, they took another goalie, they took a couple of defensemen. It wasn't as simple as, we're really going to focus on forwards here, and then when they did focus on forwards, it was a center in the first round. There was a center in the second round. They got another winger in the second round also. I mean, they had a ton of second-round picks last year. They were more willing to kind of just go across the board and pick from various positions. It was very clear early on when the Flyers got through round 6 and didn't take any defensemen and just one goalie that there was an emphasis on getting forwards, and they were all similar in certain ways. They had, every single one of them came with smarts and the ability to have a high hockey IQ, to know where to go, to know what to do, to be responsible. Some of them came with more size than others, but they all came with the potential to have size. They all came with mainly with decent skating. There's one obvious exception to that, and we'll get into him in probably a little bit. But other than that, they all came with decent skill sets and great qualities about themselves. But they were all forwards, and towards the end of it, they were all wingers. That was something that I was very impressed with.
With Isaac and with Matthew Strome, there's going to be bigger wingers on the left wing for the Flyers in the future, and that's going to help them. Like I said this last week, you know how they get worn down by bigger teams like Washington? They get worn down by bigger teams like, the Blues or the Kings out west. Now they'll be able to wear down those other teams. Now they'll be able to, crunch another player into the boards. They'll be able to play their game, and that's so crucial if you're going to build a team. You have to have balance. It can't all just be small, speedy wingers. You need a couple of guys who will wear down the opposition blue liners.
Yeah, and two things to what you said, Dan. First of all, it's that some of these players really did come with a good physicality to them, or a good sense of a physical game, which is something that was missing from some of the Flyers forwards in years past, and it's a good trait to have moving forward, because you do need to outrun teams, and you need to also be more physical than other teams. It's kind of the combination effect, and the Flyers couldn't really outrun teams before, and they're trying to get younger and faster, even with the players they're bringing up now, and then they couldn't be more physical than other teams. They were very easily worked and outworked, and in that sense, these are great picks. I want to go into something with the Strome pick, though, because, Rob, I was talking to you on Friday night, and as we were watching Friday night's portion of the draft, and it was just the first round, but I even remember telling you, if somebody took Matthew Strome, or if they traded up in the second round to take a player like Matthew Strome, I'd hate it, because of the fact that it was such a reach, given the fact that he had such the glaring skating issues, and he had fallen so far from the top that it felt that would have felt like a reach. And then when Saturday rolled around, and as day 2 rolled around, and round 2 came and went, and round 3 came and went, and the Flyers were coming up in round 4 at 106, all of a sudden you're kind of looking around and going, Strome's still out there. Why not now? That's when you take players and prospects who are going to be projects. That's when you're supposed to be able to find somebody who you go, he's got potential, but it's only a 4th-round pick. If it didn't work out, it's not like there were high expectations for a 4th-round pick as opposed to a 1st or a 2nd. And Nolan Patrick's obviously going to be an exception to the rule because he's a 2nd overall pick, but Morgan Frost has expectations now as a 1st-round pick. Not next year, but down the road. He's going to have expectations because he was a 1st-round pick. Isaac Ratcliffe, going at 35, is going to have expectations. Strome's going to have some expectations, maybe because of the bloodline, the fact that his brothers are NHL players or borderline NHL players. Dylan Strome's getting really close, obviously.
And that's why he was touted so high in the OHL. That's why he was a top 10 pick at some point, was because of his brothers.
Exactly. So I'm not saying that Strome shouldn't have some expectations, but he's not those two. And with that, you're pretty much looking for ways to see where he'll fit, see how he'll grow, and if he can get the skating improved, he's a great pick. I felt the same way about their 5th-round pick in Noah Cates. I thought that was a great sleeper pick. So they really built a foundation on sleeper picks, or the idea that as some of these players grow and develop, there's going to be a lot to like about some of these players.
The one thing that I really like about Noah Cates is that he's a Minnesota Duluth commit, and if you're a college hockey fan at all, the NCHC is like the SEC to college football. So that kid is going to leave that school battle-tested, or he's not going to leave that school a hockey player, because with that type of schedule, you leave a true blue hockey player or you're just done.
Well, and he was a captain of his high school team in Stillwater, too. So that's another kid who's got a leadership quality to him, who seems like he's mentally tough. I don't see why he wouldn't be able to handle it. So I guess one of the other things we want to do is we wrap up on the NHL draft. And we talked about a lot of the picks. Obviously, there were others that we could go into just because we just want to make a mention of some of these other players. So it was
Ustimenko.
Yeah, Ustimenko, who was the goalie, Sishko, Lixel, and Kalynuk, who were all taken in different rounds. Ustimenko was the goalie selected with the 80th pick. That was the Zach Ronaldo pick. That's what it will go down as. Sishko was taken right after Strome, with the immediate pick right after at 107. Lixel was taken in the 6th round, and Kalynuk was taken in the 7th round, and then the Flyers had another 7th round pick as well at 199, which they traded to Montreal for a 2018 7th round pick. Dan, you kind of brought it up last week, where when you got into
the pick that Montreal used to take Caden Primo.
It is. The 7th round, I believe, because I believe it was also in the 7th round that Rod Brindamore's kid got taken too.
Yeah, I think that was the 6th or the 7th.
It was one of the last two, and that's the thing. So it's like there were all these former Flyers' sons being taken in those late rounds. Caden Primo, I thought would have gone a lot higher than that, but that's a great pick. That's a great value pick for Montreal at that spot. But regardless, Dan kind of talked about this last week, where you take some of these later picks and you maybe just parlay them into moving back a year, and essentially the Flyers did that in two ways, because they got St. Louis's future first-round pick in one way or another, and they've traded for a 7th. Obviously, opposite ends of the spectrum here. The 7th round pick has far lower value than a future first, but it's still a pick for next year's draft that you hold on to. And look at what the Flyers did this year when the 2nd round rolled around. To move up, you have to pair together a few picks sometimes to just make it work. It gives them an extra piece. Simple as that.
And sometimes it's just better to trade into another draft because you just ran out of guys that you're into in this draft. So just defer to the next one, get more picks, keep it going.
Yeah, and in wrapping up what we're talking about with the draft too, I want to circle back to the Schenn trade for a second, just because we didn't really talk that much about where Jori Lehtera fits into the picture. Obviously, bringing a cap hit like he does, Schenn was making $5.1 million as a cap hit. Lehtera is $4.7 million. So obviously, this is another player that kind of falls into the Dale Weiss, Matt Reed form. Because of the cap hit, it's hard to leave a guy like that out of the lineup completely. Lehtera is a guy who has a 4th-line style, but was playing 3rd-line minutes for St. Louis, because he was playing 15 minutes a game last year. So it's kind of an in-between type of deal. He can play on the penalty kill, so that's a contributing factor to ice time. But he's like a replacement to Pierre-Edouard Bellemare. He's not necessarily a bad player if you look at 4th-line players and compare him to what the Flyers had in years past on the 4th line, but he isn't much of an upgrade anywhere else. I thought the Schenn deal was more about opening up forward spots for the youth and prospects in the organization than it was about finding a spot for Lehtera.
Yeah, Lehtera was just pretty much thrown in because St. Louis didn't want his cap hit anymore. Generally going through Twitter, see that St. Louis Blues fans had no regard for Jori Lehtera. He was also sheltered in St. Louis. Most of his zone starts, wide majority of his zone starts, were in the offensive zone. So it wasn't like he was exactly a defensive specialist, which Bellemare was. Most of his PK time was not as lengthy as Bellemare, so I don't really see him as a Bellemare replacement per se. He will probably center the 4th line, but in terms of killing penalties, shadowing somebody like Connor McDavid, I mean, he could do it. There's no reason to not believe he can't do it, but you have to see it before you can make any assumptions.
And the Flyers did what they needed to in building up the forward pipeline and doing it with size, speed, and scoring potential. For Nolan Patrick, the focus shifts to the upcoming season and trying to make the roster. For the rest, more development is going to be needed. But this was a nice draft for the Flyers on paper. It got great reviews from a lot of people around the league. And up next, we're going to shift to some off-season housekeeping items, kind of like the expansion draft, and give some thoughts on what the Flyers had done leading up to the draft. So stay with us.
You're listening to the Flyerdelphia Podcast with Kevin, Rob, and Dan on SportsTalkPhilly.com.
So So our first episode last week focused primarily on the build-up to the NHL Draft, and because of that, we held a few topics for this week's show that we're going to call off-season house cleaning, and we're going to start with the expansion draft. So the Vegas Golden Knights had to take one player from all 30 teams, and from the Flyers, they take Pierre-Edouard Bellemare. And so with Bellemare no longer with the Flyers and a few other players who were available for Vegas sticking around, what does the subtraction of Bellemare from the Flyers roster do for them?
Gives Flyers Twitter one less thing to bitch about?
Aside from that, but that's a fair point, Rob.
I was personally surprised that the Vegas Golden Knights took Pierre-Edouard Bellemare. Honestly, when you have Michael Raffl, Matt Reed, Dale Weiss, Tyler Lear, Jordan Weal, all available, and you said, like, no, let's go with a fourth-line center, I don't know, I'm surprised by it.
I think that the one big thing for the Flyers, obviously, is it takes away a leadership presence. You know, he was rewarded with the alternate captaincy last year after Mark Streit was traded, so that's something where they're going to need to name a new alternate right away. And, Bellemare was widely regarded as one of the better locker room guys in the Flyers dressing room, one of the more character personalities. So I think that's obviously the biggest impact, and I think that's part of what really enticed him to Vegas was just how good he can be in the dressing room, and that's going to be the biggest Flyers loss for now, and that's going to be the biggest impact with him being taken by the Golden Knights.
And that's the one thing I had down as well. That's the one thing I had, was that his leadership is probably going to be the thing that's going to be missed. Because otherwise, to me, he's a replaceable player, being a fourth-line type player. Yet leadership is not something that you can easily replace, but the Flyers are going to have to find a way to do that in some way, and I'm sure they will. But otherwise, he didn't contribute much offensively. His penalty kill was decent, and he had good defensive responsibilities, but he was relied on too much as a defensive guy, and that probably is why he never factored into the offense. It made him a little inconsistent at times. And it's not like the Flyers don't have players to round out the fourth line. They still have Matt Reed, Michael Raffl, and Dale Weiss. So it's not like they don't have players to throw into a fourth line role and still be acceptable in that position, as opposed to Bellemare, who, while being the prototypical fourth line type of player, also at times was being asked to jump into the third line at times if they were really hit with injuries, and that was just definitely not a fit for him. And not to mention the fact that we talked about Jori Lehtera coming over, and Lehtera fills kind of a need for the fourth line, so it's very much what shows what made him replaceable in certain elements.
Bellemare was a grunt. What he provided was just doing the things in hockey that suck, that you don't want to do. You don't want to go block a shot. You don't want to spend too much time killing penalties. That's just what he did, and somebody else now has to do it. And if you look at the players on the team, there's not too many guys that use like, oh, let's pencil him as a penalty killer. Now you're going to have to look at putting Claude Giroux back on the penalty kill. Now you're going to have to look at, maybe Scott Lawton playing on the penalty kill. You can experiment. You can put your best players on the penalty kill, but you never know if they're going to be all that good, and they also can get hurt blocking shots front in the net. So you lose that grunt type player that if he has to get hurt blocking a shot, then it's not that big of a loss if it happens to him, rather than a Claude Giroux, rather than a Sean Couturier.
I feel like it made, by losing Bellemare, by trading Brayden Schenn, and essentially opening up spots for younger players or different players, it made keeping Jordan Weal a bigger priority. Because now you were trying to essentially find a way to get these players in here. When Bellemare got selected for the expansion draft, there was part of that also closed the door officially on Chris Van de Velde. Not that it really wasn't open to begin with. It was just more or less, you can feel like that can be securely closed off now. And that suddenly took two players off the fourth line and opened up other spots, or it allowed for other players to move down from playing more significant minutes where they may not have been a fit, and put other players who need the opportunity or need the extra minutes higher up. Travis Konechny is a perfect example of that type of player, who maybe didn't get enough quality minutes during his rookie season to show everything he's capable of, and can now move into a better role because there's other players who can move down and play roles that are more accustomed to them. But I thought it made keeping Weal as big of a priority as anything in the offseason, just because of the fact that they had forward slots available. Certainly, as of the expansion draft, there wasn't any reason to go out there and get anybody else, so you were just probably trying to retain from within, and that made Weal a priority.
And with Hextall re-signing Bellemare, that allowed all of that to happen, essentially. He was soundly criticized for re-signing Bellemare. He essentially was able to protect all of his forwards that way, and also, as you said, keep the door open for Jordan Weal. As far as Pierre-Edouard Bellemare moving on to Vegas, they're going to get a nice penalty killer, but for the Flyers, they can find guys to do what he does.
Exactly. And another thing about it is that people talked about the idea of maybe making a deal with Vegas to have them take a specific player. Obviously, once the results of the expansion draft came out, there was no deal involved. This was Vegas doing this on their own and making the selection. I don't think the Flyers were ever going to make a good deal with Vegas. There was really no good deal to make.
It's exactly like he protected Brayden Schenn and then traded him. It's an asset. It's a valuable asset. No matter what you think about Scott Laughton in terms of his play or his development, he's still a first-round pick, and he's still going to be valuable to someone somewhere at some time.
I agree with that.
That's what I thought was up when they protected Scott Laughton. I thought that he was protected just so Ron Hextall could avoid losing him for nothing. You know, you can make a deal with Vegas where they take him on, or make a deal with anybody else where, you know, Hextall just doesn't have to worry about the possibility of losing Scott Laughton all for nothing.
I just don't see, I mean, you can sit there and have the pipe dream that you were going to find a way to talk Vegas into taking Andrew McDonald and make a deal that way. You know, that was a pipe dream because I didn't think, let's be realistic about Andrew McDonald's contract. It's not a desirable contract for any team to have, and unfortunately, you're kind of stuck with him. I don't think there was going to be any way to move that contract.
And they could have bought him out, and they could have used that cap hit for 6 years and at a pretty reasonable cap hit. But my big thought on that is Ron Hextall had, 11 picks in the draft? You can move a couple because George McPhee, the GM of the Vegas Golden Knights, he wanted to accumulate picks. And if you're going to make a deal with anybody, why not the team with the most picks? McDonald obviously is not a player that you want, but if you're going to stockpile picks, you know, go to the team that has the most and has a contract they really should get rid of.
Right. I mean, I just think it's also, to me, and I'm not trying to say that Andrew McDonald is anything of great value and like the contract. Everybody's on the same page here. The contract's not a good one. It's one that you'd like to move at any opportunity, and you're just trying to figure out how to get through it without, with the least amount of damage. And my case with that is, as much as you could have packaged it into something with like a pick deal with Vegas or whatever, it more or less is just, I don't know that Hextall's overly interested in doing it. He does go above and beyond to defend him, and they played him like a first-pairing defenseman last year, which, while that's not what he is, there are signs there that make it seem like they don't want to move on from him, and maybe that's why it never goes past the thought of it being a pipe dream.
I think that's mostly posturing for it. Like, no GM and no head coach are going to go out and trash a player unless you really don't like him and you really just want him gone. Because then you're just going to lose anybody in that locker room that either likes the guy or just, I could be next. So, yeah, they have to stick up for him because everybody else on the planet is trashing the guy. So it's not an indication, like, yeah, they did use him as a first pairing player, but I don't think at all that Ron Hextall wouldn't move that contract if he had the opportunity. If he had the opportunity, he would definitely move.
Oh, no question. I think if he had the opportunity. I just don't think the opportunity comes around hardly ever, I would say. And I'm not trying to say that you're not posturing a little bit to make it sound better, but I do have belief that Ivan Provorov had a better rookie season towards the end because he had to learn how to fend for himself by playing next to McDonald. I truly believe that. When you're playing with somebody who you have to bail out a little bit, and that's the veteran, not the rookie. This is a rookie bailing out the veteran more times than not as compared to the other way around, and sometimes it can make the rookie an even better player just because of the fact that he has to mature faster.
Was this Ron Hextall's best chance to get rid of Andrew McDonald's contract other than maybe in, 2 years when buying him out actually makes sense?
It probably was. I mean, I guess it was because of the fact that you had a team that had nothing at the start of it because Vegas was forming. Now they have a foundation by drafting who they have, and I think the window to do any type of trade that's centered around picks is out the window. I think the only way you could unload McDonald's contract is if you had to sweeten the pot with somebody who was a top-notch prospect. And we know that that's against Ron Hextall's philosophy.
I don't mind parting away with picks to unload McDonald. I don't think Hextall may have shared that idea, but if you're going to if you don't want that contract and you're looking for long-term flexibility with the salary cap, I can't think of another way to get rid of him other than dealing him to Vegas at that time. They took 15 defensemen, so it's definitely not happening now.
All right, so the build-up to the draft was just as busy for the Flyers with the expansion draft. With all of that in the rearview mirror, there is some clarity with the roster, and now it's time to start looking forward towards next season, and that does also start with free agency, so stick around. We'll come back, preview the free agency signing period coming up this weekend.
You're listening to the Flyerdelphia Podcast with Kevin, Rob, and Dan on SportsTalkPhilly.com.
The free agent signing period opens at noon on July 1st, and for the Flyers, free agency has typically been a place where they aren't overly active, but usually make at least one or two moves that garner some attention. At least in recent years under Ron Hextall it has been. So as the Flyers prepare for free agency to begin, what do you guys see the Flyers doing when July 1st rolls around? And we'll get into this discussion a little bit because obviously there's a couple points we need to talk about. We need to talk about goaltending because all leading up to the free agency period, it was known it was in need, but now there's a front runner for the goaltending spot and being the free agent signee the Flyers take out of this period to be the other goaltender with Michael Neuvirth. And there's a couple other names that are floating around that are potential options or could be considered by the Flyers. And we do also have to talk about free agents in a different way as well, the restricted free agents that pretty much were all given qualifying offers. So we'll talk about all of that. Let's start with the goaltending. And guys, Brian Elliott is the one who kind of came out as the leader of this thing. And Elliott with Calgary last season was 26-18-3 with a 2.55 goals against average and .910 save percentage. So I liked the idea of it because Elliott had already played in a tandem goalie style with Chad Johnson last season in Calgary. He had it with Jake Allen in St. Louis. And yeah, he's not the best playoff performer, but during the regular season, he's been perfectly capable, very similar to what Steve Mason brought. Obviously, Steve Mason's agent saying on Thursday that the door has been closed on him returning to the Flyers. So they will have a new goaltender next year. So is it going to be Brian Elliott, or is there somebody else who still could change all of that?
Honestly, I had a feeling it was going to come down to either Brian Elliott or Steve Mason for the orange and black. It was something where, obviously Mason's comments, kind of at the end of the year where it seemed like he wasn't really sure, and he was kind of, if you had to ask him, he was leaning on that he wasn't going to be back. So I figured that maybe the Flyers would get to work on something with him. Maybe they would, work something out with him and his agent. And I'm also taking his agent's report from Thursday at face value, obviously, just because that's the job of the sports agent, is to kind of stir some things up. He's trying to go to the media, just make these kind of claims about how talks are going, maybe just to try to force the Flyers' hand a little bit. But obviously, that's the side that we don't always get to see every day, and that's the negotiations between the team and players. So, but it's looking like it's Brian Elliott, 3 years at $2.75 million per year. I think that's a pretty reasonable deal for a guy like Brian Elliott, where he's one of those guys where he'll be dependable enough in the net, obviously, playoff issues aside, but he's the guy who can work well in a tandem. He's 32, so he's been around for a while. So by the time all is said and done with this contract, he would be 35, but that'll buy the Flyers some time up until guys like Carter Hart and Felix Sandstrom can get in. So that's something where I think that this could work out pretty well for the Flyers, and it's a very good deal for the short term.
Yeah, and one thing I want to point out before we get much further is that 3-year, $2.75 million average annual is the early negotiations as reported on. Elliot Friedman predicted that, or made him a prediction that he would go to the Flyers in one of his writings that was for Sportsnet, and then there was another report that said that was the early negotiation points at this point. So take that with a grain of salt for now. It's very rare that you see terms come into play at any point leading up to the free agency period. You don't generally hear about numbers until after a signing is finalized and official. So I'm taking that with a grain of salt right now. Hopeful that that's the term, actually, because I believe I saw that would make the Flyers' goaltending cap hit for both Neuvirth and if it's Elliott at that price, it would be $5.75 million as the total for the two goaltenders, and saw somewhere that 15 goaltenders in the NHL are individually making $5.75 million or more as a cap hit. So to get both of your goaltenders at that price, the term makes perfect sense because Neuvirth's got a 2-year deal. If Elliott got a 3-year deal, you're giving yourself 2 years to get either Hart or Sandstrom to the NHL. And in that 3rd year with Elliott saying, now I want the kid to start and Elliott to be the backup by that point. And it makes perfect sense. The timeline makes perfect sense. And I liked Elliott for being that kind of goalie anyway because he's a tandem goalie.
In my opinion, Brian Elliott is not an improvement over Steve Mason. Steve Mason was actually considered the best goaltender on the market by TSN's free agent rankings. And it is a sad way to see Steve Mason go because I do firmly believe that he was the best goaltender that the Philadelphia Flyers have seen since Roman Cechmanek. And now it appears there's a report that he's going to go to Winnipeg for 2 years at $4 million, and that's something that the Flyers easily could have signed him to. It's not that big of a difference between the cap hit, and I think Steve Mason has much more potential. When he's on, he's great, but it's just when he's off, he's no better than Elliott. So in this regard, Brian Elliott, yeah, it's a nice transition. He can be the backup when Carter Hart or Felix Sandstrom is ready. But in the meantime, I think this is gonna get rough. I don't know where Michael Neuvirth's gonna be in terms of his play next season. He was great 2 years ago. He was not great last year. Brian Elliott, he was great last year. He was good this year, but also had his moments. So, and in Philadelphia, I was listening to the Hockey News podcast earlier, and they said that Brian Elliott would be the steal of the free agent class in terms of goaltenders unless he went to Philadelphia. If he goes to Philadelphia, the fans are going to tear him to shreds the first time he makes a mistake, and that's it. It's a goaltending graveyard in Philadelphia. So, sorry, Brian Elliott, your time's come.
Philadelphia, massacring goalies since 1987.
I mean, here's the thing, and here's where I'm at with Brian Elliott. I kind of agree. I think Steve Mason... one thing I will say, Dan, to your point, is that Steve Mason, to me, was very underappreciated. Because when he was on his game, he was very good, and he was durable at times when they asked him to be. Started as many games as he did in a row at one point in time, and he would go ahead and do it. The problem is that I think you give a goalie like Mason that many games in a row and then still insist on we need to have Michael Neuvirth around as a second goalie to do a 1A, 1B situation, and Steve Mason wants no part of that. And that's the biggest reason that, yeah, the cap hits might turn out to be similar. They need to find a goalie who's willing to split the time. And Brian Elliott really doesn't start more than 45 games a season. He doesn't play. Last year he played 49 total games for Calgary, 45 were starts. So he doesn't really get overworked. It allows Neuvirth to still get an equal amount of work in. And this way you're not really paying a backup as much money as you're paying Neuvirth. You're using him as 1B. Elliott, at least to me, comes in as the 1A. Comes in as the potential starter. It's certainly unfortunate that the qualities that Elliott has are so similar to the qualities that Mason has, that when a soft one goes in, which, by the way, happens to every goalie in the NHL, it's the frequency that can become annoying and become frustrating. And yes, if Brian Elliott has one too many bad games or lets in a goal in the final 5 minutes of regulation that costs the Flyers a point that needs to be had, then yeah, you're going to sit there and he's going to get ripped to shreds in this city. So goes the free agent market in a way. He really was going to be one of the better options. I mean, I felt like, when you looked at the top 3 options that the Flyers had as they started to dwindle down, there were a couple options that I liked that didn't even make it to the free agency market. Mike Condon I thought would have been a decent option, and he got re-signed by Ottawa as a backup. Keith Kincaid was on the Flyers' radar. He got re-signed by New Jersey, and that left kind of Ryan Miller, Brian Elliott, and Jonathan Bernier. Ryan Miller doesn't seem like he has any interest in going off of the West Coast. He wants to stay put as close to where Vancouver would be as possible, so Anaheim's looking like the likely destination. And then Bernier had the Flyers connection. It started to sound like that was who the Flyers were going to go after, and it seemed like they were destined to do it. But then again, I think at the time, when Bernier was considered possibly the guy the Flyers were really going to go after, then I think it made it sound more like they wanted to give Neuvirth the chance to start and Bernier to be the 1B. And it could have been vice versa. We won't know, and we'll never know, because if that's not the direction the Flyers go, Brian Elliott is very clearly going to slot in as 1A, and Michael Neuvirth will clearly slot in as 1B. And that can always flip depending on how they're performing, but it takes that whole situation out of the picture. And Bernier isn't even really a thought at this point. But that's why I kind of pitched the question, is it going to be Brian Elliott or could it be somebody else? You know, the Flyers were linked to more goaltenders than just Brian Elliott, and that happened very fast. That really caught on Thursday, and then looks like it's going to happen by Saturday by all means necessary. And yeah, the fact that there's terms out there makes a difference, I think.
The thing about the Elliott signing is that, especially in this day and age, you're not signing a player based off of past performance alone anymore. You're signing a player based off of what he can do for the team now and going forward. And Brian Elliott is ideal in this kind of circumstance because he can just kind of stand in until the young guys, Hart and Sandstrom, are ready to go.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And that's why I do see him as a fit, because of the fact that he was going to be one of those goalies who was willing to play with Neuvirth, split some time, and take a short term. It's obvious where the Flyers want to go with this eventually. They want to get one of those two up and in the system and in the NHL, preferably as quickly as possible. But it takes time for a goalie. And especially since both goalies, especially Hart, is still very young. And you go, well, he's going to need at least next season and then the season after to go pro. You know, he probably next season slots back in with Everett and then goes back to and needs a season in the AHL as a pro before he can come up. And there's your 2 seasons with the Elliott-Neuvirth combo. And in case anything happens with Neuvirth's injury history or anything like that, you've got Anthony Stolarz available.
My big concern with signing Elliott is that in order to succeed in the NHL, you need one of 2 things. Preferably 2 things, but you're going to get one of 2 things. You either have a defense that's good enough to carry a goaltender or a goaltender that's good enough to carry a defense. And neither one of those things are true for the Flyers in this upcoming season. If they do get Elliott, this defense isn't good enough to carry both Elliott and Neuvirth if they play the way they've shown that they typically play, and vice versa. So, in my eyes, this is just Hextall picked 2 backup goaltenders, and let's just see if one of them can play like a starter for one season, and maybe the other one plays like a starter the next season. I don't think it's a good recipe for success. If I knew this is the way it was going to go, I would have probably been on that bandwagon too of just sign Mason.
I want to shift gears from the goalie talk to what I had said earlier was kind of, I thought was one of the Flyers' biggest priorities moving forward, and that was keeping Jordan Weal from getting into free agency and re-signing him. At this point in time, it's really going to be a mystery about not where he goes. He's got pretty much a final list already determined. The big question is, does he choose to go back to Philadelphia or does he opt for a place like Vancouver? And you look at the whole situation, for the longest time it felt like Weal was going to just end up re-signing with the Flyers. And then as the week went on and more talk came into the picture about the number of visits he had with other teams and these possible deals that were coming his way and how much interest there was, it started to look less likely. So when Saturday rolls around, is Jordan Weal still going to be a Philadelphia Flyer?
Is he worth it to go through all of this negotiating and now, how much are you going to pay for him? Because I know we talked about, how far would we go to keep Jordan Weal on the Flyers? And you said you would go almost to $2 million, like 1.7, something around that area. And I said, like
1.75 is my maximum.
Yeah. I'd cap out at 1.5. If he wants anything more than that, let him go. Because you have no idea what this kid is. Is he Corey Conacher? Is he Marty St. Louis? You have no idea. And obviously having Marty St. Louis sounds really good, but Corey Conacher, that doesn't sound good. So at this point, I think the kid's gone. I think he's already made up his mind. I think he's he's got that wanderlust. He wants to go home. He wants to get paid. And I think Vancouver might be more willing to shell out the money, and I think Hextall is just like, all right, go, leave. We'll see. But I don't consider this a huge loss because, trading Brayden Schenn to have him replaced by Jordan Weal, there's already a logjam, and he can be replaced with anybody. It could be Oscar Lindblom. It could be Nolan Patrick. Maybe Valtteri Filppula. Maybe he'll have a good season. Maybe he won't. But there's a ton of guys on the team already at forward that can fill the shoes of Schenn or Weal. So if you're not going to get him at the deal you want, let him go.
Well, guess what? Looks like we got some breaking news here. Jordan Weal is sticking around with the Philadelphia Flyers. He signs a 2-year deal. This is according to Darren Dreger. Just announced by the Philadelphia Flyers, too, to make it official. Darren Dreger had it first from TSN, but the Flyers just made it official as well, that Jordan Weal is sticking around. And pretty much, as we had talked about earlier in the show, for merit to keep Weal in the first place, he probably slots into somewhere in the top 2 lines on the left wing. So obviously that's a very big deal for the Flyers to keep him around. They had a spot for him for sure. If you assumed that with all the moves that were being made throughout the rest of the offseason, that Weal was continually a part of the picture. There was the threat that he could go. Obviously, the visits to Vancouver, he had visited with a couple other teams as well, and that certainly caused concern, but the Flyers get it done, and get it done 2 days before free agency opens. So that's a really great way to go, I guess. It gets something knocked off the checklist. It's one less thing to watch for on Saturday now, but we'll see where it goes, I guess.
Yeah, the logjam continues to be a logjam. Just one more forward onto a crop of forwards that, wow, where are all these guys going to go?
Yeah, there's a lot, and we'll have to just see how it shakes out. I mean, I certainly do like, and we kind of touched on it a little bit, you just don't know at this point what Weal is. Yeah, he had a great quarter to half of the season, if you want to call it that, by playing 23 games last year and 30-some-odd games in his entire career to this point. But to get him on a 2-year deal is at least a little bit more low risk. I think 2 is a good trial period. It's very much the bridge deal type that people were talking about for Shane Gostisbehere instead of the 6-year deal that he got. Obviously, I'm going to assume that the 2-year term is exactly what they had agreed upon before, and it was just the money they were going for. We don't have any terms of that yet. Trying to see if there's anything as it comes out, so obviously we're kind of going on the fly here. But so far, it doesn't look like anything in terms of terms is going to be released, so we're just waiting to see what happens. But we'll see what happens down the road with Weal. I still think he fits a need, and I said he's top priority, so Ron Hextall must have been... Somehow Ron Hextall tapped into our recording, since we're not live, and heard what I said and got the deal done, I guess.
Yes, so much for what I said. Like, we weren't live, so we can't tap in and say, like, oh, Dan, you think Jordan Weal is gone? Well, he's sticking around for, for a few more years. As soon as I take a stand on anything, as soon as, like, nah, he's gone. No, he's sticking around. Just first thing I have anything, like a strong point on, it's like, nah, Dan, you're wrong. But you know what? Keeping Jordan Weal, he's a good player. We'll see if he's more like Corey Conacher, or we'll see if he's more like Marty St. Louis. Those are obviously the extremes, but he can be somewhere in the middle. But if he's anything, I'm seeing from Pierre LeBrun, 3.5 over
That's
2
perfect.
years, so that would be 1.7.
That's what we were talking about. You don't max out at
1.75.
more than 1.75. And you freed up the money. So that's perfect. What a great deal, I think. I think that's a great term for him without overpaying for him to see what he's got for the next 2 years and see if it's worth giving him something more on the longer term. No, but that's what I was saying about about 1.75 is where you top at it, and I thought that the money that they got for Jori Lehtera, trading Brayden Schenn for Jori Lehtera, and that little bit of cap relief, it's not much, but it was just enough, could possibly sweeten the deal just a little bit more for Jordan Weal. And sure enough, that's probably what did it, because I guarantee you that I think they were sticking over 1.5 and couldn't get it done, and 1.75 got it done. Because free agency just keeps drawing closer, and there's names out there that you'll always hear about or that come up, and you may throw them out into a list of players that the Flyers should talk to, should look into, but it sometimes never really goes that far. But the Flyers apparently have a link to Justin Williams, who is a free agent this year, and Scott Hartnell got bought out by the Columbus Blue Jackets on Thursday, and instantly that was a potential, not a potential name to come to the Flyers, but a name people were pining for again because he was such a fan favorite. So is there a reason for either of those two to sign on with the Flyers if you're Ron Hextall?
No, absolutely not. There's already a logjam at forward. Like, Justin Williams wants to go somewhere to win. That's probably not going to happen in Philadelphia. Scott Hartnell, he can't skate. Arguably, he could never skate, but he can move at some point. He falls down, in Philadelphia at least. I don't know how many Hartnell downs he had in Columbus. But and then people are pining for Yager. who's 45, with a logjam at forward. Let's be serious about this for a second. Let's let the kids play. Stop pining for players that were good when they were in Philadelphia, but let's move on. Let's let them go somewhere else and try to win one last cup, and let's, let Ron Hextall focus on building this team through youth and not letting Oscar Lindblom go to Lehigh Valley for a year that he may not have to spend in Lehigh Valley because you had to re-sign Scott Hartnell so he could play on the fourth line and probably drag down the fourth line.
Here's what I'll say about this thing, because I like Justin Williams as a player. I always have, and in the years since he was a Flyer. That's one that you sit there and you go, Justin Williams is considered one of the ones that got away when you talk about players who went on to have great success with other teams, win a Stanley Cup with other teams, and the Flyers didn't have him. And Williams was with the Flyers for 4 seasons and then gone, just like that, before he had a chance to let his potential be fully realized, and look what he turned into. That being said, I wouldn't wish 2 years here on Justin Williams at this point because of where the Flyers are as a franchise at the moment and where Justin Williams wants to be at the end of next season or the season after that. And he wants to win. And I do like him a lot, and I would want any player who's comparable to Williams to be on my team. And even at this stage of his career, he's going to be a quality bottom 6 forward. The problem is, if you're the Flyers and Ron Hextall, you don't have a place to put him, and there's also the whole question of winning now. You're not in that position yet. You have to bring kids up to do that, and you're already trying to find roster spots for them. Now you're going to add another player. Hartnell, I think the ship has sailed, and the good point I saw on Twitter earlier today was, let's not forget that Scott Hartnell was the player Ron Hextall traded for R.J. Umberger, and you saw how that went. So there's a comparison there. The two are linked forever at this point. The problem is that so many people, I think, look at Scott Hartnell as an instant fix to the power play, and you go, that was 4 seasons ago. You got to move on at some point and start something new. And there's a lot of young players that you can put onto the power play and into Brayden Schenn's spot on the top power play unit and have some success with him. Watch them blossom, and it's going to be a lot more fun than trying to reminisce about something in the past because a fan favorite came back. That's my thought.
I think that the thing is that a lot of the people who are calling for Hartnell to come back are the people who are still to this day pissed off about that Umberger trade. And yeah, I get it. It wasn't exactly the prettiest trade that went down.
It wasn't the prettiest trade, but you know what? It ended the same way for both teams. They both got bought out way before the contracts were up.
And yeah, Hartnell had more even strength 5-on-5 points than most of the Flyers roster, I think, with the exception of Jakub Voracek. But I mean, come on, that's because he's playing on a significantly better Columbus team than the Flyers were last year. Let's be honest.
Exactly.
If you want to see Justin Williams back in a Flyers jersey, hop in a DeLorean and stop Bobby Clarke from trading him for Danny Markov. That's the only way this makes sense. For Scott Hartnell, that ship has sailed. You guys have touched on this enough. Scott Hartnell isn't going to fix the power play. The power play is already going to get reconstructed under what I presume to be a different system. So you have no idea what they're going to do. It's not going to fix the power play, and you're just going to keep a guy as a power play specialist. Flyers Twitter was complaining about Brayden Schenn for an entire season because he was a power play specialist. How are they going to react to Scott Hartnell when he's on the fourth line? Taking away a spot from a young player who should probably be on the team, getting his mitts dirty, learning the way of the professional game at the NHL level, and that's it for Scott Hartnell. Don't re-sign. Don't bring back Scott Hartnell. Don't bring back Justin Williams because, as you said, Kevin, Justin Williams doesn't deserve that. And Jaromir Jagr, call him. Call him. See how he's doing.
But Jaromir Jagr's a great guy. Jaromir Jagr's a great guy. Don't get me wrong. I'd call him just to find out how he's doing.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Call him. See how he's doing. Ron Hextall played against him. Chris Therien is a part of the Flyers broadcast. They know him. Call him. See how he's doing. Hey, man, you in shape? 45 and in shape? That's great.
And you know what? I think Jagr will find his way somehow. It's not going to be in Philadelphia. And quite honestly, let's put it this way. Jagr sat there and even tweeted out, no one's called them yet. Okay, so no one's called them yet. There's not even a reason to discuss Jaromir Jagr to the Flyers. At least there was a link for Justin Williams. There was a report out there saying, okay, they're one of the teams interested. At least the past history, still fairly recently with Hartnell, makes a little bit of sense. at least to bring it up and wonder for 2 seconds maybe. But Jágr, I don't see why you would bring in a 45-year-old player, even if he's one of the greatest players who ever played the game, because of the fact, second most points in NHL history. It doesn't make a difference that he's a 45-year-old player when you're trying to get younger.
And I had been under the impression that there was some progress between him and the Panthers on a return for next year, because obviously he can still produce. He's played really well alongside guys like Alexander Barkov and Jonathan Huberdeau. So
that's the thing that would make the most sense.
Yeah, he can still produce, but I think he's just going to stay in sunny Florida where he likes it.
Well, anyway, aside from the potential free agents, which at this point in time, if there's people out there who are getting their hopes up about a possible reunion with Hartnell or Williams or whatever, and don't think too much into that. And the other thing is that one of the other things in terms of looking for deals that are going to happen is the fact that the Flyers did put out qualifying offers to all of the restricted free agents. This includes Anthony Stolarz, Mike Vecchione, and a whole host of others. Taylor Lear was on there, Cole Bargeron. Roman Lyubimov got an offer probably, from what I saw, just so the Flyers can keep the rights. He's probably going to go back and play in Europe again, play back in the KHL, I think. And Alex Lyon was on that list too, the other Phantoms goaltender who had a really good year with the Phantoms last year. I don't think anybody's going to deny that. For somebody who was an undrafted free agent signing, he had a really strong year. And the bottom line is that those deals tend to work themselves out. So I think for every single one of those players, it's a matter of time before we hear that they're back again.
I think the big thing to take away from this are the players that are arbitration eligible and the ones that are not. And the ones that are not are Stolarz, Lear, Lyon, and Lawton. So right then and there, you have a pretty good grasp on your leverage. Like, unless they say no to the qualifying offer, you're pretty good that they'll probably either sign it or you'll work out something later on. In terms of the ones that are arbitration eligible in Bargeron and Lyubimov, as he said, he's probably going to go back to the KHL, keep his rights, and even if he doesn't go back to the KHL, he is waiver exempt, so you can send him down to Lehigh Valley with no problem. So with arbitration out of the way, and you can probably keep Lawton, Lear, Stolarz, and Lyon for cheap. You got to take into account that Lawton and Lear are not waiver exempt, so they either have to be Flyers next year or test out the waivers and probably lose them. So you're going to have 2 spots at forward for them as well.
Exactly, and that's something I think will work itself out later. The first priority of this is to get people re-signed, and by putting out the qualifying offers, the process has started on that. We'll have to wait and see where it goes. Like we said earlier with the free agency portion of this whole thing, you're going to be looking at a new goaltender for the Flyers come Saturday. Looking like Brian Elliott. There could be a shocker toward the end of that whole process as we get closer to noon on Saturday. Who knows? But it does look like Brian Elliott. You can keep the former Flyer names in the back of your mind, but don't expect too much. There's really nobody else on the market that fits the Flyers' needs, and then just wait for the restricted free agents to kind of re-up. So, looking like Brian Elliott could become a Flyer as of Saturday, but we'll have to keep an eye on that. And otherwise, get ready for a crazy couple of hours just around the NHL. Not necessarily for the Flyers, because even last year it wasn't that crazy, but there are some pretty wild deals that can come out on July 1st, that's for sure, and it's going to be fun to watch. So that's going to do it for this episode of the Flyerdelphia Podcast. We want to thank everyone for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube, as well as listen on the website. On our next episode, we're going to start putting the pieces for next season together. We'll have a review of what happens in free agency, take a look back at development camp as well, and start to preview the schedule ahead, too. Schedules came out, too, last week. So we'll start to look ahead at the Flyer schedule in October and beyond in the 2017-18 season. So once again, thanks for listening, everyone. For Rob Riches and Dan Heaning, I'm Kevin Durso, and this has been the Flyerdelphia Podcast on SportsTalkPhilly.com.
This has been another edition of the Flyerdelphia Podcast with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaning, presented by SportsTalkPhilly.com.